Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at game number 5 from the 1971 Canada's tournament between Petrosian, who many thought would run away with this tournament, and his competitor, and that is Bobby Fischer. Up until this point, we are tied. Bobby Fischer won the first game, Petrosian the second game, and we have had a draw since then. Bobby Fischer has the white pieces going into game number 5 and starts out with e4, which he has done many times over his lifetime. e5, knight f3, and then knight to f6. So getting into the Petrov defense after the knight takes here, a d6. There's an entire video that you can watch on the Petrov defense I've made if you're curious why the knight does not come down here to e4, which would be a mistake. d6, the main line. Knight comes back here, and then the knight's going to take. So both sides have taken the e-pawn from their opponents most times, and that's exactly what Bobby Fischer does, is he completely avoids this knight, recognizing that it's not going to be doing too much right now. Can't really threaten it unless he wants to bring his bishop out here. Does not want to stop his pawn, so he continues with pawn to d4. Now the knight comes back here. The main line that you'll see nowadays is d5. This is centralizing the pawn a little bit more and making this outpost for the knight here on e4. But decides to go and bring his knight back to f6 and then bishop to d3, preparing to castle on the king side. Petrosian continues with bishop to e7, getting ready to castle on the king side himself, and then we see h3. Now it's pretty common just to play knight to c3 here. This gets more material involved into the game. Not sure if Bobby Fischer had just been playing with Petrosian and felt like there was the bishop coming down here to g4, wanted to stop that threat, but either way decided to play h3, more defensive play, but does make sure that there doesn't come anything on the king side of the board. And then both sides castle, and then c6. Another interesting move as well. Instead of c6, there's lots of options here. You get your bishop involved into the game, bishop here to e6. The most common here is knight to c6. Even if you want to swing your rook over here to e8, you probably want to get your bishop out of this lock that it has here on e7 at some point, but rook to e8 makes a lot of sense. To play c6, blocking off your knight coming into c6, definitely something that I wasn't expecting to see as I was analyzing this game. Rook d1 from Bobby Fischer, controlling that open e file, and then knight to d7. So this does offer up for the knight to come to multiple squares, but it's probably not going to come to the center of the board, which makes it a little surprising to me. c5 and e5 are both blocked off by this pawn here on d4. So going to be looking for another option. Could definitely exchange here if Bobby Fischer were to take, but no real need for him to do that right now. Decides first to bring his dark square bishop out here to f4, and then rook to e8. All those make a lot of sense. Pawn pushing forward to c4, and then knight to f8. So it seems like this was what Petrosian had planned all along. Get the knight back here so he can bring it to e6 if he wants to centralize it on that front, or g6. He does have some options here, but right now it is definitely on the 8th rank, not doing as much as he is probably hoping for right now. c3, just getting his knight more involved into the game. a6 here, blocking off some of the squares on the queen side that Bobby Fischer could go to. Queen here to b3. Knight to e6, so centralizing that knight. Bishop comes back here to h2. It is under attack here. Bishop comes back to f8, opening up for the rook to also control the open e-file. Both sides are basically doing the same thing here. Bobby Fischer, since he has completed development, has all of his pieces here, can easily swing his rook to e1, put double rooks here, and have more control over this e-file. Pawn to b5, recognizing he can't really control the e-file, can't really control the king side, decides to start pushing on the queen side of the board. Rook to e1, says, I don't really care about the pawns over here right now. Bishop to b7, and then queen to c2. And this is an interesting pot where I thought Bobby Fischer could have tried something differently. You always want to be looking at where your opponent is moving away from. This bishop here on c8 is protecting the knight here on e6. As soon as it moves, it's no longer protecting that. The pawn and the rook are the only two pieces of material defending this. I think bishop to f5 makes a lot of sense. You can't really kick this bishop away with something like g6. You could just have an exchange right here. Rook can come up. This is going to be pretty good for white. You can also see there's completely decimated the pawn structure in front of the king here. But he doesn't, and instead decides to play his queen to c2, and then Petrosian, I'm not sure if he just immediately saw this, but then played g6. Now you can see this is very different. The bishop can no longer come to f5, put a lot of pressure on this e-file with his bishop. So I think Petrosian in this spot got away with something where Bobby Fischer could have had a much bigger advantage. Now Bobby Fischer plays b4, trying to push on the queen side as well. Pawn captures, bishop recaptures here on c4. Knight swims back to c7. So Petrosian really trying to figure out what he's going to be doing with this knight. It has moved all over the board. Bishop comes back to b3. Bobby Fischer always liked to keep his bishops back here on this long light square diagonal, whether if it was on a2 or b3 here, putting a lot of pressure on his opponent's king if it's castled on the king side, and there was no pawn here on e6. So it's just something, if you analyze a lot of his games, he always liked to park his bishop back here on the queen side. We do see an exchange on the board. So right now Bobby Fischer does control the e-file with his rook. Knight comes down to d5, and then pawn to a3, controlling this pawn here on b4. Another interesting idea that he could have played is queen to b2. This is a fun way of defending the pawn, because if the knight were to take here on b4, Bobby Fischer has the surprise move of bishop takes on f7 check. After the king takes, then the queen can take here on b4. So you always want to look at the threats that you have with your bishop checking your opponent, and then putting material behind that with discovered attacks is always something to be thinking about. That's one of the good reasons that Bobby Fischer has of always eyeing down his opponent's king with his bishop. But instead decides to go ahead and play a3, just solidifying the pawn chain. After a5 here, we see the knight capture. We do see an exchange, and then the pawn coming up here to b5. So that Bobby Fischer cannot connect these, have a stronger pawn structure, decides to go ahead and play a4. Definitely think that's the right move here. Both sides have 6 pawns. Petrosian on one side, though, has double pawns here in the middle. Now, this is a pawn by itself, doesn't have any other pawns to protect it. So really Petrosian, if you look at it, is going to be looking to attack this pawn any way, shape possible, and then as much as he can hold on to these pawns, knowing that it's going to be pretty difficult going into the endgame here. Bishop comes back to a2, queen to b6, attacking the pawn here. Queen back here to b1, defending that, and you start to see all the material eyeing down on this b5 square. Rook to a5, attacking that. Rook over here to b2, attacking that. Knight to e4, and you may say, well, that doesn't necessarily attack it right away, but it's definitely coming, because after bishop to f4, the next move is knight to c3. So the knight, the rook, and the queen all attacking that right now. Bobby Fischer recognizing can no longer hold on to that pawn. It's now time to start looking at different options. Queen to c2, starting to eye this other pawn here on a4. So after the rook takes on b5, rook takes, knight takes up here, and then the queen can take on a4. So yes, we are still equal in material. Bobby Fischer has a pass pawn on the A file, and Petrosian has double pawns on the D file. So things in this position definitely looking up for Bobby Fischer, but still has a pretty active position that he has to worry about from his opponents. Queen to A6, decides to go ahead and exchange here. Bishop takes on A6. And then bishop to e3. And this is important because it kind of looks like there's a free pawn to go ahead and take here on d5. But after bishop takes on d5, then Petrosian can just play knight to c3. This is not only attacking this bishop here on d5, it's also preparing for the knight to come down to e2. That would be a fork. King and the bishop are under attack. This bishop would fall. So there's no real good move for Bobby Fischer. He could just try to get as much material as he could. Bishop takes on f7. There is an exchange. And then he could play king h2 maybe. Has some options here, but just trying to avoid knight coming here to e2. So while the pawn does look like he can be taken, unfortunately that would be a trap. So he correctly sees that and plays bishop to e3. Now the knight takes on a3 as soon as the knight comes down here. No longer threatening coming to c3. Does need to stop that pass pawn. Priority number 1 for Petrosian. And now Bobby Fischer can easily recapture here on d5. Both sides equal in material. going to be difficult for either side to win here. But bishop to c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop comes up c6. Bobby Fischer not looking to exchange right now. Knight to c2, starting to attack the bishop and the pawn here. Says, yeah, you can go and take my pawn. It's protected by my own pawn. Then bishop comes down, says, I'm going to attack your knight here. So then we see the bishop come down, attacking the knight. You can just see how all of this is complex. All of the exchanges, all of the interactions going into the endgame. If there's one incorrect move, this whole thing falls apart. Luckily for both these players, they're extremely talented. They're not making a lot of mistakes in this game. So bishop takes, bishop comes down, takes here on c2. Bishop comes up to d5, and in this spot, they decide to draw the game. No real way for either side to get an advantage. So game number 5, Bobby Fischer, he came out the gates pretty strong. Game 1, got the win. Maybe thought that he was going to run over his opponent. Remember, coming up into this, his previous 2 opponents, he had won every single game. Won game 1 against Petrosian. Since then, he has not won a game. Lost game number 2 and had 3 draws after that, 2 of which he has the white pieces. So he'll be looking to come back in game number 6 with the black pieces and see if he can make something happen. Petrosian, on the other hand, recognizing that he really has the advantage right now. Held off Bobby Fischer in game 5, and going into game 6, he does have the white pieces. Thank you guys so much for watching game 5. Hopefully you're enjoying the 1971 Canada's tournament. Always fun to watch and analyze some of the old historic chess matches between 2 of the greatest chess players that we have to analyze games on. But thank you guys, and I will see you again in game number 6.